Welcome. It's a pleasure to be able to introduce tonight Professor Selwyn Cudjoe from Wellesley College via Trinidad. Selwyn Cudjoe is Margaret E. Deffenbaugh and Leroy T. Carlson Professor of Comparative Literature and Professor of Africana Studies at Wellesley College. From 1995 to 1999, he was the fourth Marion Butler Maclean Chair in the History of Ideas at Wellesley, and he has published extensively on Caribbean literature and history, including, for example, books on A.F.R. Weber and the making of the Guyanese nation, the intellectual tradition of Trinidad and Tobago in the 19th century, and V.S. Naipaul, A Materialist Reading. He's here with us as a visiting professorial fellow, which we're delighted to have him here for a few months, and taking advantage of that, we're going to be listening to Selwyn tonight telling us about William Burnley and slavery in Trinidad and Tobago.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you, Kate. I want to thank you again for having me and being such a wonderful host. I also want to thank Maxine, she's not here, but it's good of you to have me here. And also it's good to see Gab. and others, my friend who I met recently, and this young lady's name, I don't remember. Anyhow, two things before I begin. One is when I began to write the piece, I started very, very sort of large and generous. And I thought I should follow the life of this man, William Burnley, from 1800 to 1850, but I realized that's just too much for one day. So I shall rather speak about him from 1800 to 1834, the end of enslavement. Secondly, it's great because this is the very first time, even though I've been thinking and talking about this guy Burnley for the longest while, this is the first time I'm doing an official presentation of him, even though I began to write about him as early as 1983, when the whole question of black power came up. So with those two caveats, I shall begin. And I will read the piece and we'll have a discussion afterwards. I've always been told when you do these things, better be careful. The piece is entitled Ignorant Negroes, Tyrannical Masters. William, and I may say one thing, I think it was the very first, I don't think there's on any other biography on a slave master or slave owner in Trinidad. There might be, I don't think there are any. So this is really the first. The title of my piece is Ignorant Negroes, Tyrannical Masters, William Burnley and the Caribbean Slave Experience. Growing up in Tyrannical, Trinidad, West Indies, in the 1950s, there existed a large, faded mansion in the Orange Grove Savannah, which had seen the last of its glories. Yet it stood there as a colossal on this magnificent expanse of real estate, which at the time was one of the largest savannas in the country, second only to Queen's Park Savannah in Port Spain, the capital of Trinidad. It reminded one, this colossal building, of some glorious days of a time long past. I was a young boy and could not really have known that in this residence there once lived one of the most important men in the West Indies during the first half of the 19th century. As a young boy, we all knew that Orange Grove Estate, its formal title was the Trinidad Sugar Estates, was central to the life of every person who lived in that village of Tyrannical. A century before, or even 50 years before, there were several sugar estates in the area: El Dorado, Paradise, Laurel, Garden City, etc. But by the 1950s, they had all ceased to operate. Only Orange Grove remained as the central sugar estate in the area around which all life turned. At crop time, that is from around January to May, the entire village came to life. It was the source from which all of the villagers received the necessary cash to buy items such as kerosene and bits of clothing. And together with the meager salaries they received from Orange Grove, they made ends meet by cultivating their provision gardens, tending to their chickens and goats and pigs and cows. My grandfather, Robert James, my uncle Niles, my brother Winston, and I, for a short period, worked at the estates during crop time. I was saved from that experience by becoming a pupil teacher. My family, though, my aunts, my uncles, my grandparents, we all rented lands from that estate until the 1960s, when the sugar industry itself was dying and the estate was forced to sell its lands to its tenants, the major portion going to a local conglomerate called Home Construction Limited. In the late 1960s, when Black Power and Marxist radicalism set in, I began to understand that these lands, the Orange Grove Sugar Estates, were owned by William Hardin Burnley, the biggest slaveholder in the country, who, it turns out, was responsible for shaping much of the island's policy between 1810 and 1815, the year in which he died. Even as slavery was coming to an end, he made various trips around the Caribbean and Latin America, quote unquote, he says, for the sole purpose of observing and considering the state and efficiency of the laboring population in these various places, under different aspects of slavery and freedom, to enable him to form a more correct opinion as to the probable results of the measures now in progress in the British colonies. He went to St. Croix, he went to Barbados, he went to Jamaica, he went to Venezuela, he made a whole trip of it. When slavery ended, however, he made a gallant effort to recruit labor from all around the world, including the United States, to ensure that freedom of the slaves, that is, free labor, did not prevent his profits from flowing into his coffers, and to ensure that the planters of the island had the labor they needed to ensure the continued production of their sugar estates. But this is getting a bit ahead of my story. Who exactly was William Hardin Burnley? When did he arrive in Trinidad? And how did he become such a powerful figure in Trinidadian and West Indian affairs? William Burnley was the son of a British gentleman, Hardin Burnley, who went to Virginia in the 1760s to make his fortunes. When the US Revolutionary War broke out in 1775, Hardin Burnley took the royalist side to the great astonishment of his brothers and certainly to his own regret, because, of course, the royalists lost. As the war raged on, he fled to New York, where William was born. In 1786, William Hardin Burnley and his family returned to London, where he became a successful businessman, an underwriter for Lloyd's, and a director of the East India Company. In 1798, William visited Trinidad, liked what he saw. In 1802, he returned to the country, where he stayed until his death, although he resided for short periods in London and Paris. Years later, Burnley testified that he spent most of the best years of his life in Trinidad. When Burnley arrived in Trinidad, he was one of the most educated of its new immigrants, having studied at Harrow, the famous boys' school that educated Winston Churchill, Prime Minister of England, and Jawaharlal Nehru, Prime Minister of India. In 1832, bewildered by the challenges Burnley was posing to British rule in the island, Lewis Grant, the governor of the island, acknowledged that Burnley came to the island, quote unquote, with the advantage of birth, capital, and education superior to probably any other colonist, and certainly with his own objects in sight. In 1807, he married Charlotte Brown, who gave birth to two children, William Frederick and Joseph Hugh Burnley. Quickly after his marriage, Burnley erupted on the society. In 1810, he had the good fortune to meet George Smith, the Chief Justice of the island, with whom he became fast friends. Smith aided Burnley's rise to fame and fortune by allowing him to act as his desporatio general, whose function it was to protect the widows and orphans of the society. Together, they used the office to fleece the widows and orphans of their property. All the property became the subject of litigation was placed under Burnley's control and received the revenues that were paid on them. No account of these transactions was ever kept, and the rightful owners seldom received payments. When things began to get out of hand, Smith fled the island. On July 12, 1810, Mr. Black, a member of the ruling council of the island, sent a devastating letter to Mr. Joseph Marriott, Trinidad's agent in London. The letter read as follows. The governor has long seen, and with great regret and dissatisfaction, the imperiousness of this man, but he never expressed his feelings openly until now. An extraordinary meeting of the Cabildo is to be held this day, at which the governor will preside, and we are to have the full meeting of council on Wednesday, both of which have for their object the illegal, arbitrary behavior of this man, and are supposed to take some steps for arresting the evil. His ambition is now entirely absorbed by one object, to throw into the hands of Burnley all the property can find an excuse for laying hold on in the country, either from the death of the proprietors or from claims of creditors, and that the revenues of these properties shall be by him, after having good pickings out of them, remitted to his friend Mellish. Burnley, you see, there's still this letters going on to Marriott. Burnley, you see, has the office of the Depositario General of his court, a place of immense popularity and responsibility, according to Spanish laws, for a while we had both the Spanish and the British laws that govern the island, and for which the whole is obliged to give real security to a very large amount. But nothing of the kind has been done. Burnley is the general at large, and it is computed by the Benz de Functions, along which he will be in possession of the judge's pleasure. In a short time, you'll have made a fortune of $1.5 million at that time. The next year, Smith had fallen out of favor with Thomas Hislop, the governor. He wanted to go to London to present his case to the Secretary of State for the Colonies. However, Governor Hislop himself was supposed to travel to London to see the Secretary of State, so he forbade Smith to leave the island during Hislop's intended absence, since Smith, as the chief judge, was supposed to act as governor in his absence. However, leaving the country was no problem for Smith. Burnley helped him to leave surreptitiously by disguising him as a sailor and getting him aboard a schooner at Macquarie Bay in the northeast or the northwest of the island. Needless to say, Black's suspicions turned out all to be true. After Smith left the island, the Cabildo, that's the ruling council, named Samuel Span as the new General of Deposits. After he did this necessary invention, he discovered little of the money that was taken in by Burnley and Smith could not be accounted for. At the end of the year, he informed the governor that he could not get any accounts of judicial deposits from Smith, and therefore humble praise, quote, Your Excellency's interference to prevent any such departure of His Honored George Smith from this island, or his deputy receivers W.H. Burnley and J.P. Littlepage, or any of the receivers of deposit whom His Honor George Smith may have appointed, end of quote. The governor immediately convened the Cabildo to deal with the matter. They agreed that if Smith wished to leave the country, the governor should ask him to give a proper record of the monies he or any other parties had received in pursuance of his duty. Smith responded promptly with all the necessary formalities and courtesies. He says, and I quote, I beg to state to Your Excellency that at this moment there is not, I believe, a deposit of any kind in the hands of anyone under my authority, end of quote. We call it boldfacedness, that's boldface. Burnley used the months he acquired, or the money he acquired, to build up his businesses and to invest in real estate. at the end of his stint as the General of Deposits, he had acquired so much of the country's land that anyone who wanted to do business in the island had to deal with him. In the 1820s, when the planters panicked at the possibility of the slaves being freed, they sold the estates undervalued. Burnley bought up many of those estates and became an even wealthier person. When the enslaved Africans were emancipated in 1834, Burnley received £48,000, the most of the compensation that was paid to Trinidad slave owners. And I think Nick Draper's done a very good job on that, and we have all of the figures which we have in terms of exactly how much money that this guy got. Between 1835, even though slavery had ended, the profits of Orange Grove estates, same as I talk about, but his largest estates, totaled something like £28,000, which meant that Burnley profited whether slavery existed or not. He used his wealth to develop his international contacts and to consolidate his power. At his death, he was the richest man, was the richest man in the island and its most prominent political figure. Given his wealth, Burnley had to get into the political milieu to preserve his fortune. And I was reading, I guess, Lenin's piece on unions. And the one major principle Lenin advocated in his polemic against Trotsky and Bukharin until the trade unions was this. He said simply, politics is nothing but the concentrated expression of economics. Politics is nothing but the concentrated expression of economics. Politics must take precedence over economics. End of quote. Burnley, of course, was no Marxist, but he knew where the real power lay. When Sir Ralph Woodford, one of the most progressive governors of the islands, arrived in 1813, he named Burnley to His Majesty's Council of Trinidad and Tobago, the council that served in an advisory capacity, but Burnley remained a member until he died in 1850. So he was a member, he became the senior member, and of course was at the political arm where, of course, all the other directions are made. One of Woodford's first tasks, of course, when he came in, because both Trinidad and Guyana, as new colonies, always needed labor, as you probably well know, the fact from the older colonies, Jamaica and Barbados. But one of Woodford's first tasks was to secure sufficient laborers for the island, Trinidad being notorious for not having sufficient laborers to till its soil. 1 year after he arrived, he asked each member of his council to come up with suggestions to entice free laborers to settle in the country. Mr. Bidge, the chief judge of the island, favored the importation of European settlers. Lawrence Nehil, a member of His Majesty's Council, suggested that Africans be brought to the islands as indentures for a period of 10 years. Burnley rejected this idea. He felt, and I quote, that although robust and hardy, they were so grossly ignorant that it required to be taught everything they were to do. He suggested the settlements of Asians, quote, because they are a docile and intelligent class of laborers, already accustomed to agriculture, to whom the climate would present no drawbacks, and whose very prejudice of caste would keep them from combining with the slaves, who, so long as slavery should exist, would be always more or less disposed to revolt. Asian immigration, excuse me, 1 second. Asian immigration would not only suffice to bring the whole island into cultivation, but would eventually, quote unquote, banish the baneful system of slavery, end of quote. From this early point, therefore, in Trinidad's history, the terms of engagements between the Indians and the Africans were established. The enslaved Africans, he thought, were nothing, quote unquote, but ignorant Negroes, as he described them in another context. As behoved his prominence, Burnley did not get along well with Woodford or any of the other governors who came to the island. As far as he was concerned, they were merely birds of passage. He remained the one constant presence in the island. As fate would have it, Burnley's power and prestige in the island was increased when, in 1815, his sister Maria married Joseph Hume, a member of the House of Commons a self-appointed guardian of the public purse, and a friend of the English-speaking people. However, he easily reversed his position when it came to supporting his brother-in-law economic interest in the island. Hume was a friend of James Mill, with whom he attended Montrose Academy, considered the best school in the region, and developed a strong personal friendship with David Ricardo, the famous English economist. Hume would give immense assistance to Burnley as he pursued his economic interest and engaged in quarrels with the colonial office. And here's a very important point I think Said makes in love his work, that interconnection. Burnley being interconnected, being the brother-in-law of David Hume, and I must thank my friend for that idea. I didn't find it. He was doing some research and he discovered of Hume and and his ties to Burnley. So I've got to give him that publicly because it is very important. But the important point here is, what we see here is another kind of move, where Burnley is not merely a local personage, but he's working hand in hand with his brother-in-law, who has a very high position in the House of Parliament and the House of Commons. And of course, he used that as a means of ensuring his prominence and getting his ways through both Trinidad and in Parliament. Around 1820, in keeping with his new status, Burnley built a palatial mansion in Orange Grove, equal in status to the governor's residence. It was said to contain 101 windows, one more than the governor's residence in St. Anne's. Now that's very important, you know. Your building having one, but of course you had to keep one closed. In fact, and I thought it was a joke until I saw, nobody saw Lawrence Scott's new novel, Something on the Bamboos, and he talks about that also. So having one more window was a sign of his prominence, one more than the governor, even though he wasn't allowed to open, he had to keep that one closed. This was the building that I so admired as a young boy, the place that Burnley and his fellow planters gathered to strategize against any attempt to improve the conditions of enslaved Africans. In May 1823, when Thomas Fowell Buxton brought his first motion against slavery, he suggested certain reforms to ameliorate the conditions of the enslaved, which of course was carried through or sent down to the governor as an order in council. What were some of these reforms? Well, among other things, these reforms called for the abolition of female punishment, the reservation of certain days for the Negroes to labor on their own provision grounds, their own plots of land, the discontinuance of working on Sundays, the abolition of the Sunday market, and the abolition of urging the field slaves to labor by the whip, and the introduction of religious instructions of the enslaved. They became much more holy and much more religious. I suspect it would be less akin to revolt. On June 26, when Woodford sent out the contents of this order to the members of his council, it came up for discussion on July 9th. Burnley and his fellow planters were decidedly against the measures. They met at Burnley's mansion in Orange Grove to formulate their plan of attack. They believed that the supporters of amelioration in the House of Commons were totally misguided, and that enslaved Africans had not arrived at a state of civilization where they could appreciate the blessings of freedom. Part of his famous argument was that we knew the local conditions better than you up there, and so you can tell us what to do. In fact, I don't discuss it here, but they even reached a point where, of course, they had their own Declaration of Independence, no taxation or representation. That's another part which I shan't deal with now. And it doesn't sound so, it's not as fortuitous to think it is, because remember the 13 colonies. In fact, at a certain point, around 1750, 1760, the Caribbean countries were producing much more in goods and service than the American colonies. They hadn't gotten Louisiana yet as a result of the French. So it's not so fortuitous to think that they could be making those kinds of demands. Yeah, so on June 1823, when Woodford sent his contents of this order to the members of council, Burnley and his fellow planters were immediately against these measures. They met at Burnley's mansion in Orange Grove to formulate their plan of attack. They believed that the supporters of amelioration in the House of Commons were totally misguided, and that enslaved Africans had not arrived at a state of civilization where they could appreciate the blessings of freedom. At another level, Burnley and his fellow planters could not contemplate that Negroes could be brought to a higher state of civilization without the generous help of the whip. Negroes, he argued, and I quote, are children of a larger growth, and the fear of punishment is now the effect which under the regulation proposed will require the application of it. They were ignorant and stupid. To refrain from whipping them was tantamount to allowing them to retain their savage ways. And he goes on to make certain claims, which of course, as planters they had vis-a-vis disciplining their own slaves. Yet, the most reprehensible part of regulations to the planters in Burnley was the suggestion that they cease to whip the female slaves. Now, the female slaves was very tough. They led a lot of stuff, but most importantly, they could stoops. They could never be done. They never gave it. And so he felt, at some point he said, how could we keep our slaves, under manners or discipline if we could not whip them? And that became, to Burnley and his planters, the most reprehensible part of the regulations. Such a regulations, Burnley argued, was so monstrous and extraordinary that I hardly know how to approach the subject. The intention of such an order, we are told, is to elevate the female in the scale of society, whilst the men are left as they were before, establishing in fact a decided superiority in favor of the former. End of quote. One wonders, though, if this was a case of male social bonding or misogyny, particularly against those females who were black. It is no wonder then that in 1832, when it looked as though the British Parliament was contemplating the immediate abolition of slavery, that Birmingham's fellow planters went into a tizzy. The principal source of their fear was the Orleans Council, which the planters felt had the potential to ruin their operations. To make matters worse, the Negroes refused to work, set fires to the plantation, demonstrated total indifference to the destruction that was taking place around them. These actions of the Portsmouth Gazette observed, quote unquote, we learned with much uneasiness and regret that the slaves on the Concord estate evinced by their conduct during the conflagration a total want of any desire to save the property of the respectable human owner, end of quote. Malcolm X would have called them free Negroes, who were determined to obtain their freedom by any means necessary. Even as the enslaved were making their wishes known, the mighty shadow of Calypsonian, where's my Calypsonian friend, would have been saying something like, they're feeling the feeling, baby. They were feeling that they were getting on close, coming to independence. But as they even get, excuse me 1 second, please. Sorry. Yet even as the enslaved were making their wishes known, the white inhabitants were intent on assisting asserting the inviolable rights to their property enslaved and resisting efforts of the Colonial Office to ameliorate the conditions of the enslaved. With this in mind, the white inhabitants met on Monday 25th, 1832 to select a deputy to represent their cause in England. They agreed that Burnley, quote unquote, the fit person to represent the inhabitants of Trinidad and to act as their deputy. Owing to talent, high character, and great practical experience of this gentleman, we may look towards the best results of our just causes from his gratuitous executions of our favor. To make a long story short, Burnley was sent up to England to begin to argue for keeping the enslaved. Even as he met with the officials from the Crown Office, the Emancipation Day, in spite of all his protestations, was being signaled. Seeing the ferocity of the enslaved in Jamaica under the leadership of Samuel Sharp, in the summer of 1822, Lord Howick, the parliamentary undersecretary of the Colonial Office, wrote to the Jamaican government to say, quote unquote, the present state of things cannot go on much longer. Every hour that it does so is full of the most appalling danger. Emancipation alone will eventually avert the danger, end of quote. That was true for Trinidad as well. Trinidadians also believed that the king had sent, quote unquote, their free paper in the form of an order in council on the 2nd of November, 1831. No man or woman had a right to withhold freedom from them. It was only a matter of time before freedom day arrived. Once the Emancipation Bill passed, though, Burnley changed his focus to deal with issues of compensation and apprenticeship, the new form of labor. Having spent much time in London, Burnley, in fact, he stayed there from 1832 when he went up to 1837, even though he remained a senior member of council. Having spent much time in London, Burnley was better positioned to present his views to the colonial authorities. He was most intent on trying to shape the terms of apprenticeship and how the slave owners were to be compensated. Nicholas Draper has observed that once the Slave Compensation Commission was established, the feeding frenzy began, and the claimants who were close enough to the metropolitan centers had the best chance of shaping the new system and getting the most out of the system. This is one reason why Burnley remained in London for almost 4 years after the Emancipation Bill was passed. Burnley, it seemed, though, was most worried by the idea of free labor or free labor class evolving as a result of emancipation. On January 24, he wrote a 16-page letter to the Secretary of State in which the words deepest anxiety, fear, dismay, impending ruin, injurious results, valueless, and other such emotive terms inundated the first 3 pages of his text. It was almost as though, in their microscopic quantum ways, these emanations of consciousness revealed unknowingly an unknowable future, perhaps something that Camus will call the absurd, where everything was about to be thrown into inevitable chaos. Burnley was not sure how things were going to turn out, or how the evolving situation would affect the wealth he had gathered over the 30 years he spent in Trinidad. This was a significant existentialist moment for him. However, apart from this intense anxiety about free labor, etc., Burnley was riddled with 4 major concerns. 1, the fear of a limited African workforce. B, a large fertile land which, as he said, possessed the richest soil on the most favored part of the globe, which he feared the apprentices would use to undercut his dominance and control. C, an increase in the cost of production that was likely to render his machinery ineffective, as he said, or inactive and valueless. And D, the ability of the workers to command whatever price they wanted for their labor, thus raising the labor cost, a situation that would be disastrous for him and other planters, or as he would say, ruin them. Of course, that was once Trinidad became, once emancipation took place, the big question was the question of labor. There was less labor, the lands were fertile, and he was wondering, of course, would they get laborers to do the job. Burnley fear of being ruined also revealed a deep-seated racism. He called for the introduction of white immigrants, not to work in the factories, but to superintend the manufacturing occupations for which they were, quote-unquote, considerably qualified. He notes, and I quote, "In every industrious department where skilled manipulation is more required than hard labor, their superiority over the African race will be manifest." End of quote. He agreed, quote unquote, with the experts who argue that there are some generic, in today's language we use the word genetic. He says some generic differences in the African race, rendering them more prone to idleness and vagrancy than Europeans, which not a few persons have boldly asserted, end of quote. Burnley was not unique in his opinion. Europeans such as William Cobert believed that Africans were, quote unquote, dull, easily excitable, and disposed to laziness, end of quote. A century later, Paul Sartre affirmed, quote unquote, the Europeans have been able to become a man only through creating slaves and monsters, in his introduction to Fanon's Wretched of the Earth. Having been away, I've got about 2 more pages. Having been away for a long time, that is since 1832, Burnley returned to the island in June 1834 in time to see the response of the newly manumitted slaves to their former freedoms. 2 letters he wrote to Nassau W. Sr., a famous Oxford scholar who worked on the poor laws, and this begins to give the kind of contacts he had. He's writing to a guy called Nassau Sr., and if you know anything about the poor laws, he did a very big work with Chadwick, I think, on the whole question of poor laws. But that was his reach. Even that he left an introduction to Adams and so on from the States. But of course, this gives us a sense of how he really felt about the slaves and the emancipation. 2 letters he wrote to Senior, which said, on August 9, he wrote the following letter to Senior. The Negroes will not comprehend the system of apprenticeship, which, when fairly explained, present generally no advantages to them. These principally benefited on the few that had hard and tyrannical masters, but throughout the island their treatment was humane and their work moderate. They didn't believe slavery was a rough thing at all. As such, they do not hesitate to abuse the king for making any law at present the subject. As they said, if not free for 6 years, better let, this is of course a slave speaking to him, if not free for 6 years, better let we stand as before till that time come, end of quote. They show themselves excellent lawyers. All who have come before me plead as a defense for deserting their estates, that the managers call them together and read them a paper saying, quote unquote, all will be free on the 1st of August. But when questioned as to the restriction On reservations, no one gave an answer. On September 3rd, Burnley reported the next letter to seniors saying that the grand appointment of apprenticeship in the country was politically perfectly successful. He meant, as he said in communication with Hume, that apprenticeship had changed nothing. In spite of this success, he still disparaged the strike actions of the apprenticeships when he noted, quote unquote, the bribe of 20 million has effectively neutralized the opposition of the middle classes, and the Negroes are too ignorant to understand the real position in which they are placed. They made a strike to obtain what they considered their freedom, but being promptly met by force, they have relapsed into their former obedience and terror of their masters, and incapable of nice distinctions are satisfied now that slavery exists for them until 1840. Whatever may be the term given to their present existence, it is the impetus of class slavery. It's the impetus of class slavery, a term he used previously, therefore which now carries apprenticeship onwards in this colony at a smooth and steady pace. But as intelligence spreads, this impetus will slacken, and the system, in my opinion, will work less efficient every day. End of quote. Burnley then believed apprenticeship was a failure, just another form of slavery in a different guise, as he'd written to Hume. Its demise, he said, would be slow and gradual, or its promoters would proclaim its success to the world. He did looking at Antigua, he says, the further experiment in Antigua, he says, will soon show us what is to be expected from African free labor, under the most favorable circumstances of density of population. He says that if the Antiguan results were favorable, then he says it would be concerned in this colony where without a considerable influx of population, we shall find but few hands to cultivate our estates after 1840. And whether we even cultivate them up to the period will altogether depend upon the fiscal measures pushed in Great Britain with respect to foreign sugars. Burnley then would diverge after 1834, the next 16 years of his life, looking for foreign laborers to undercut the gains made by Africans in the island and to ensure that his profits kept on flowing. But as for the progress of the island in the proximate future, in the near future, that is until 1814, when apprenticeship was carried to the end, he would have to depend on the ignorant Negroes and tyrannical masters to see the island through. He never believed that the ignorant Negroes could amount to anything unless they were guided by the tyrannical masters. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Selwyn. Before I open it out to the floor, just a quick question. You mentioned that there's no biography of any other slave owner or plantation holder in Trinidad. I just wondered if you could say something about what do you see as the value of taking this biographical approach to this particular swindler and rogue.
I had a wonderful quote from, which I brought my manuscript in. It's a wonderful quote that says that biographies has a way of really showing up many things that probably strict historical accounts do not. In other words, the way I thought I should handle it, even as I handled this afternoon, is that, as I said, my great-grandfather was born in 1833. That's the year that slavery ended. My great-grandmother was born in 1833. And all that, we have all that in the book, a handbook, a sort of notebook by my grandfather. This is my first introduction to this stuff. And one of the things, after slavery ended, Burnley was, because once slavery ended, the Africans simply began to bargain with the owners. They began to work 3 days a week. And so wages went up. And apart from squatting and taking over lands, the Africans, of course, began to have their plantations, something called the foothills of the Northern Range. Now, my uncle, whom I interviewed about 30 years ago, told me we had a provisional ground on the foothills of Northern Range. So in fact, Burnley was fulminating against my people. So in other words, this was not something that's sort of extraneous to me. In point of fact, I think it has the advantage of giving it a kind of flavor by doing a biography, even though it's a very strict historical study looking at all of the sources, that it makes it much more personal and make it much more intimate with the audience. So I think taken from that standpoint, telling the biography is very, very, to me, I found it very, very helpful. I think it's one of the ways in which to handle such a story.
Thank you. I'll throw it open. Gad?
Well, that's very interesting. And he's obviously a very interesting character, Selwyn. But building in a way on Kate's question, which I think is what she was sort of thinking about it, as so am I, is, so here's this very interesting character, very educated character, very wealthy character, but here's a large or a significant planter class, very diverse planter class, coming from a variety of different places, as you know, I didn't tell you. So the question which one has to ask immediately is this guy, was this guy representative of his class? How different was he? Were there divergences within the planter class? Those kinds of issues.
It was a very narrow class. It was a very narrow class. And it seems to me that he represented the innings of that class. I think if you could tell his story, it gives you a good sense of what was happening and transpiring in the society. I don't think that you have to necessarily, I mean, somebody else could do that, but you could do a whole history of that class and how they operated. But I think just looking at his actions and how he operated in the society gives you a good feel of how that class operated. And since one of the titles I was playing with, of course, he was almost what I would call the prime minister. He was the major man of society. I was speaking to Selwyn Ryan, who did that whole big, massive work on Eric Williams. And you know, he did a fantastic biography on Eric Williams. And in a way that Williams was you could look at the growth and development through the eyes of Eric Williams between 1955 and 1980 and get a good sense of development in Trinidad. I think you could do the same thing with Burnley. You could take a look at Burnley, look at his development, how he treated his folks, and get a good sense of how the society developed in that time. And so I said to Selwyn, you did the anchoring story, I will do the beginning story. So I think it gives us a good sense of how he functions. Even as, for example, we have some of this, for example, when you're doing the apprenticeship bill, which I know is your big concern, that the Secretary of State would send him copies of it, even while he was in Paris, to send his comments on these bills. The question, for example, of the immigration, people coming in not only from India, but he went to the United States, went from probably Vermont right down to DC, looking for that, trying to get slaves to work on the plantation again. He led those efforts. So as the major figure, apart from simply financial figure, as the major political figure, I think we get a good sense of the society through him. So I think it's one lens through which we could look at the development of that period, sitting between, I would say, 1800 and 1850.
So what's his relationship with the French Creole planting class?
Well, he had no he had no relation with the French Creole. I mean, the fact of the matter, by the middle of, as you well know again, that there's a whole big struggle of the English to set their own rules and laws. Burnley represents, by the time you get to, I guess, about 1830, the French Creoles begin to fade, in the sense that the English are beginning to set their laws, they try to get away from the Spanish laws, and the English are trying to take over the society. And what Burnley is doing, he represents that class of people, that group of people, who in fact is setting the new the new scene.
So I mean, he's involved in changing the laws into English.
He's a major member, senior member. But I think the important class there is not even the French Creoles, would be the free Creoles, the free colored population, because part of the problem there in 1825, how do they get represented? Because they're not represented, even though they own certainly much more slaves.
So I was thinking specifically, as you're talking about the planting class, those French Creole planters and slaveholders.
What was the question? What about
Well,
that?
in terms of how Burnley related to those, because there is this difference between the religious perceptions and various other things, which crosses Trinidad society right from the onset that the British take the island, and you know, French Creole being the lingua franca for the black population in the 19th century.
Well, with the patois, I think.
Yeah, I mean, so you've got.
But I think there are two different questions here. I think if you're talking about the cultural influence of the French Creole is very great on the society. And of course, by 1875, you know it, that the English is sort of taking over. But I think in terms of the of course, the members of the French, that society, are also members of the council, and people like Gantoum and others are members of the committee, and
doing their thing. But I'm saying that what you have is the ascendancy, if you look at that period, of, because when Woodford comes to the country, Woodford's major concern is to make the country English, make it English in the sense of bringing English laws, begin to define the society within English terms. And Burnley, of course, the church which I went to, he supplied the lands for the church and so on. He is leading that class, as it were. And so I don't think, in terms of, they're not much, he becomes the leader of that class because their interest, in terms of their commercial interest, is neither French nor English. The commercial interest is how do we maintain our profits, how do we get the most competition for our slaves, and he becomes the leader of that. Whatever the internal differences might be, and probably there were, that they were more cultural rather than economic in the sense. Burnley becomes the leader of the economic class or the economic group under society. The person who's negotiating, there's no French Creole negotiating with the colonial office. No. The only person negotiating is Burnley, who goes up there, and because of his contacts with Hume and Marriott and others, he has an inside track. They're listening to him, they're working with him, they're sending all of the papers. So that in terms of the economics and the shaping of the economic direction, and even political dimension of the country, Burnley is the man. The French Creoles do not figure in that. Even though they got a lot of lands, they got interest in the estates and so on, Burnley becomes really the economic and political leader of the society. Yes, sir.
Do you think we could use this study to make generalizations about the wider Caribbean?
Could I use the study?
To make generalizations about the wider Caribbean?
Yes, you can. I think, for example, one of the things you could look at is, of course, you have the major conflict between the older colonies, be it Jamaica and Barbados, as opposed to the newer colonies, being Guyana and Trinidad, what kinds of policies they must have, what it means for immigration, what it means for compensation, because the certain slaves, for example, they were even getting more for their slaves because they had, they were in Trinidad and Guyana. So I think the first thing happens is in terms of the nature of the colonies. The second problem is that we were a crown colony government. So of course that we're using Trinidad as an experiment, which could be then used for the older islands. And I think at the third level is that in terms of how we approach the questions of the development of the directions of societies, I think could be interesting. The other point about Trinidad, given the nature of the immigration policies, in terms of the nature of the homogeneous society as opposed to the heterogeneous societies, that what it allows us to see is how the policies of even a guy like Sidney Burnley, in terms of immigration, shape the nature of the society. So I think at least from those points of view, you could begin to see the interconnections. Yes, sir.
You were talking about how I know this goes slightly beyond the period that you've linked to the period you've set yourself, but you were talking about how immediately after abolition, he managed to maintain his profits.
Yeah.
I mean, was this general, or was he specifically able to do this better than most?
I think he was able to do better than most. But this comes from, there's another major slaveholder from the South called Lamont. And Lamont's grandson, in fact, did the first sort of biography, about probably 20 pages of Burnley. And there you have those figures and those profits. But in about 1888, a fellow called Guppy, who became very important in terms, not so much his son, I guess, in terms of science, was talking about the fact that he got to Trinidad about 1830. He was also a man who had studied, he had been a lawyer. And he joined Burnley formed something called the Agricultural Society, for example, because what Burnley was very good at was doing studies. In fact, I made something called the Trinidad Negroes, written about 1825 when they went around the entire island, just gathering data in terms of the ways and the mores, which I make the analogy in my piece to Du Bois's piece, The Philadelphia Negro, in terms of the early sociological studies, because he was akin to gathering data. And they did the same thing in 42 with something called the Agricultural Society, where again he went around to all of the plantations, gathered data and how he was doing.
Burnley, and according to Guppy, this is an 1888 piece, he managed his estates much better. And to some degree, in terms of his slaves, he seemed to have given them much more, treated them much better, I suspect, and he's able to get much more out of them. So, in terms of the implications of it, is that he was able to manage slaves much better. He was quite a much more astute businessman, and of course was able to get more out of the system. So I think that would account to some degree for, and of course he had a number of, I don't know if you want to call it economy of scales. He had many more plantations. He had much more than many. So I guess you could set the terms of their employment, the terms of the working conditions. But what I would gather from Guppy is that Burnley was a very astute businessman, which may account for the fact. Even though at some point the price of sugar fell and so on, he was able to manage in a much better way than the other plantation owners.
I should raise a question about your sources as well. You're looking at Q at the moment during your period here, but I mean, did he write extensively? Does he have diaries?
He wrote,
letters, etc.?
He wrote, I don't know, that's the question. I don't know about the diaries, and I will have to check his son. But what the major source at this moment of my research are the tremendous amount of letters and so on that exist at Q. I do not have, as I said, the same guy Lamont had access to certain diaries, etc. But in Q we have a lot of letters, a lot of correspondences with the various governors, etc. Which is, I mean, I was stunned by the amount of stuff that is simply there. But in terms of diaries and other kinds of stuff, I have not been able to get into those yet. I wanted to get the sort of narrative straight. Part of the problem is that no one has written. The only references, apart from the Lamont piece of about 16 pages, is that people like Fraser, the 2-volume book in History of Trinidad, has made allusions and spoken about Burnley. But nobody has written about Burnley. So I think the first thing you really want to get straight before you get into everything else is to simply get a narrative history right. Who was he, where he was born, what did he do, what is his activity? Once you've done that, and I'm saying there's sufficient information just to be able to trace his life through that. The newspapers also have got some accounts, which I got some of the newspapers from the newspaper library in Colindale. There are some of the newspapers. But a lot of the stuff that was sent to the various governors were reprinted in the newspapers. And there was a lot of the stuff, it was almost a sort of public, so you got some other stuff on him. We also were able to get a few letters, that, for example, letters to Senior and so on, from Bristol, one of the archives. So the state of the study right now is just trying to decide who he was, what he did, the nature of his activity, and just to follow him through and get something of a narrative. Then, if it is, I mean, of course, the other papers, for example, would have allusions to him, which are beginning to take a look at. I think Lord Russell's papers, for example, has some references to him, but I haven't gotten there. But as of now, I'm simply trying to decide who Burnley is, get a narrative history of him, and if it's possible, if it exists, I will try. I don't know. His son, part of the problem of his son was got caught up in a lot of litigation in terms of his son had, I think it meant not Scotland, one of those places, where he used the proceeds to buy a lot of stuff and he got jammed. And so there are a lot of bankruptcy proceedings against him. And so if the son may have it, I don't know, but I haven't gotten there yet.
Yeah, Karen?
It would be interesting to know a couple of things. Again, following Kate's question, it would be interesting to know if there are planter accounts or plantation accounts or anything, given the extensive holdings he had, whether there are any records of that kind somewhere. That's number one. And the other question I have, of course, one of the elements of the population, things you haven't addressed, at least in your paper today, but the wider society and the importance, for example, of the free people of color in Trinidad, which you know is a very large group and a growing group, and what kind of attitudes and what kind of views he had about that growing population might also be interesting to think about.
Well, where we are now, so the way I am in terms of the studies where he gets into a lot of trouble. For example, there's a great big debate between him and the Attorney General in terms of one of the very pressing issues that around 1833 you had these the liberated Africans who were being held in places like Cuba and so on, were being sent on to Trinidad. About 3 or 4 prisoners in Trinidad. And again, as the leading planter, he wanted to get most of the planters. Now, where in fact the British wanted to use the liberated class and even use the emancipation to and I find it strange, the language is there as creating a middle class. Now, that is their language among the boatswains and the artisans, that their goal was to create a middle class. And so therefore the question became, having these slaves, at about say 600 or whatever, one batch of 200 and so on, how do you distribute these slaves?
Liberated Africans.
The liberated Africans, sorry.
Yeah.
And the question becomes, who set the rules? Now, Burnley and his committee, as a member of the council, want to set the rules. And the way they set the rules was that we should allocate these liberated Africans in proportion to who have the biggest plantations. The government is saying, no, 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 no. Everybody should have a chance at the action. Because even the small artisan, give them one, because we see it. Now, a great big debate takes place. And of course, the guy Rotary, who was, I guess, the first guy who began to speak out against him, seen as being very insensitive, seeing the Africans as nothing, wanted to use that lottery to satisfy his own kinds of ambitions. The debate takes place, and then, of course, the Secretary of State sent on the fellow called Scotland to sort of arbitrate and say, let's see what's happening here. And what his recommendation is that the council consisted of too many plantation owners, too many proprietors. We've got to have people from the professional class. We've got to have people from the mulatto class or the colored class. We have to, and here you see for the first time the attempt to diversify even the council. So at that point, what you have happening is that at this point, they're being brought in at the level of representation in terms of and of course, quickly thereafter, this guy from Sanford, from Naparima, what's his name? Philippe, was brought on to a member of the council. So here you have a question of the expansion of, through the pressures to make the society, take away, remove power to some degree from the proprietors and the sugar proprietors and sort of expand it. So in this sense, you begin to have this group coming in as a member of administration or certainly giving advice to the governor in terms of that.
What year is this?
What year is what? This is happening?
Yeah.
This is 1834, 35. 1835. The Attorney General is a guy called Rotary, and he's writing, and of course, incidentally, you have James Stephens, who appends to one of the letters, yes, Burnley seems to be, he's a great man in terms of business, but in terms of personal, a lousy person. So you have the dissipation of that part. Huh?
A lousy person.
He didn't say lousy, he said something to the point that, well, again, I should have done my picture. But he's saying that he's a very selfish person. He's great in terms of business and so on, but he doesn't care about it. Because the big argument was, Rodney was saying, he has no concern about the Africans, they're simply property to be shared. And he wants to get the biggest batch. And he did a breakdown. And where they had to change, they had amended laws, would give more to other smaller planters and boatswains and so on, so they could begin to share the wealth around. So you have at that point, coloreds being made members of His Majesty's Council, etc., etc. But Burnley is not, Burnley's thing is, and I think, it happens to be focused. I mean, you're doing a biography of someone, you can't do everything. Burnley's concern is, and my concern is, that Burnley is the major political, major economic figure there. And in that point, he's driving his own agenda and shaping policy at the level of apprenticeship, at the level of slavery, at the level of bringing slaves in. In fact, at some point, he's made the agent. And so my thing is to keep it narrowly focused, to get at least the story out. Then those factors could come into the degree that begin to affect it. And I think you have enough of a story about Burnley himself. The materials there are so great that one could simply talk about the emergence of this figure in terms of how he shaped the society, how he worked in society. To the degree that other factors come in, I mean, I've done work on my other book when I did my book to talk about the other kinds of factors, like people like free mulatto and that whole class of people. I've done that stuff. I've done a whole lot of stuff on the French crew. But I think here I'm concerned in those you're talking about very important formative years from 1800 or make it 1810, because to about 1850. And the issues are really economic issues, political issues, and of course, Burnley as the man was carrying the banner for the economic and political interests.
Okay, maybe just one more quick thing, returning to Gad's original comparative question. I mean, within a class that's particularly, within a reactionary class, he does seem to be particularly reactionary, particularly...
But I wouldn't say particularly, part of I started, and this is going to be interesting kind of thing. I look at people like a guy like Thomas Jefferson. And Thomas Jefferson is quite a contradictory figure. Thomas Jefferson, at one level, was a slaveholder. I mean, he and Sally did that stuff and all kinds of good stuff. He's also a fellow who helped to write the Declaration of Independence. Now, you have to deal with those contradictions. Contradictions are inherent in life. Burnley at one level is very reaction and very racist. He couldn't help but be. That was the dominant motive of the time. But at the other level, he's well-traveled. He marveled when he got the steamship in about 1840. He'd been to France. His wife lived in Paris because she couldn't take little Trinidad. He used to go there up and down. Been to Europe, been to Germany, been all over the Caribbean, been all over Latin America. I mean, one of the words I use in terms of, he had a very, almost a mania to write. He wrote and wrote and wrote. He's not, I would say that part of the challenge of talking like figures, of those complex figures, they are products of their time. On the other side, they are talking, when you talk about taxation without representation and break, those are very progressive positions. And what happens is sometimes I think that we tend to, certainly when we do work in the Caribbean, to cut off the whites in terms of those who react to those things from the larger population. And it seems to me that that I think he's a much more complex guy than that. In fact, when I started, and I'm still looking at it in terms of, not as a model, not as a model. I mean, he has introductions to see Adams, for example, in 1825, to see this guy, Benjamin Rush, and so on. He's going to the States. And he's not a fool. And so part of the complexity of the man is to say, at one level, yes, you have those tendencies, but there are other kinds of tendencies you want to look at. And I think one of the guys to really look at in this sense, I mean, he's not, is a guy like Thomas Jefferson. And the reason why I made that point, one of the things I was talking about is that we tend to downplay the progressive nature of some of their political activities because we see the relative insignificance of the Caribbean now. But at that point, in the 1750s, 1780s, and so on, the Caribbean was doing much more. Places like Nevis and Barbados doing much more business in the United States than even the United and some of these major countries. So that if you didn't do it by scale, if you could remove Louisiana, which they got in 1804, whatever, there's all the 2 cent stuff, that it begins to try to present these guys in both their complexities and their reactionary kinds of natures, and see what kind of person you get out of it, and try to do it in that kind of way. So that's sort of where I'm at right now, where I'm stuck at right now. The Negroes and also the partners.
His wife is off in Paris. Do you have any evidence about outside children and how he treated them, or anything in his will to?
Yes, we have his will. We have his will. Now, you're going to be careful outside children. Now, again, going back to Lamont, he's writing all these wonderful letters, which you get not from Q, but from Lamont. How he misses his wife and all kinds of good stuff and so on. But he has a mistress in Miss Farquhar. And Bernie is saying that the Lamont is saying, well, how can Miss Farquhar not see this? So he had a mistress in Miss Farquhar. And again, going back, I don't know what the source of Lawrence Scott is, but Lawrence Scott, in his novel, says that he was even seeing the daughter of Farquhar. All right? But I do know one thing. She was intended not to come back to Trinidad. She loved Paris. And he traveled from London to Paris, etc. And on his will now, he left her bequest. Left a bequest for the Farquhar's daughter. And so he did take care of those. And of course, the son, who
who became a diplomat. This young junior son became a diplomat. I take him work on the French something embassy. When they come to Selwyn yesterday, I was aghast at the fact that this woman is still meddling in their affairs. She's taken too much, and he calls all kinds of names. But if Miss Burnley is enjoying the modernity of Paris, and in fact was at home and shared the house, I mean, she's in a room and so on and so forth. And of course, while he's doing that, while he's having his whatever, he's blazing the slaves for having too many women and the woman being adulterous and all that kind of good stuff. So the contradiction is there in all of his things. But yes, he did have, from the evidence, Miss Sparkle was his mistress. I don't know what Scott had, but Scott said he was even seeing the daughter Augusta. But he certainly in his, which was filed in New York incidentally, in his will, he left bequests for the mistress and the mistress's daughter.
Well, I think we all look forward to hearing about part 2.
Yeah.
Thank you very much indeed for